Will tell.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to give a moment for people to register or get logged in. Again, welcome to CNHED's monthly meeting and fireside chat with George Jones. Steve?
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for coming to our monthly meeting and our fireside.
You're on mute, Steve.
I had clicked the button, Raina. I'm sorry. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Glaudet. I'm the president and CEO of CNHED. I do see we still have some people coming in, but we're going to get started. Thank you for joining us for our monthly meeting and fireside chat. Before we get started and I introduce our guests, I just want to mention two important dates in 2024. This is a year where we'll be celebrating two 25ths. The first is the 25th anniversary of the first investment in the Housing Production Trust Fund, which was 25 years ago this year. We're going to be hosting a celebratory event at the National Housing Center at the National Association of Home Builders on June 21st from, I think it's 12 to 2. Raina, am I getting that right? Is it from 12 to 2?
11 a.m.
11 to 2. And we're going to have an exhibit hall where we're going to be providing some exhibits of some of the Housing Production Trust Fund projects across the city. And then we'll have a luncheon. We've, of course, invited the mayor, and you'll hear from some of the other people who've been involved with projects and even policy for the Housing Production Trust Fund over the years. And then on October 22nd, CNHED will be celebrating our 25th anniversary. We're turning 25 this year. And on October 22nd, we will have a really nice dinner event at the Andrew Mellon Auditorium. And I think that starts at 6, but you'll see notices and postings on the website. But I just wanted to lift up those dates. So I'm delighted to have my friend George here with us today. All of you know George from his work at Bread for the City, but George has been a good friend and an ally, a visionary and a leader, not just here in terms of the local impacts that Bread for the City provides, but in the larger context of the work that's being done with racial equity. So let me give you a little bit of George's bio, even though we all know him. He's been CEO of Bread for the City since January of 1996. Of course, we know Bread is a nonprofit that provides food, clothing, medical, legal, and social services to DC residents living on low incomes. He's responsible for managing all of the administrative, financial, and programmatic aspects of Bread for the City and has 131 full-time staff. He has led BFC's growth from a 1.2 million operation in 96 to 22 million in this past fiscal year. He's overseeing the agency's development of their 9,000 square foot community center in Southeast DC, an 11,000 square foot expansion of BFC's Northwest Center, and the construction of BFC's new 2,700 square foot center in Good Hope Road in Southeast. Under his leadership, Bread has taken on the challenge of attacking poverty through a racial equity lens. The agency is committed to embedding racial equity in all of its direct services and organizing and advocating for affordable housing. BFC strives to be an anti-racist agency and one that helps lead the movement of creating a racially equitable DC. He is also chairman of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, a national racial equity organization, and he serves on the boards of the directors of the DC Primary Care Association, the DC Affordable Law Firm, and the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. And it's just my pleasure to welcome George. On a personal level, I just want to say when I took over the reins here at CNHED, George was actually the first CEO of another major nonprofit in the city to reach out to me and say, hey, welcome to the fray. Let's have lunch. Let's get to know each other. And I have always appreciated that because particularly when you cross sectors coming from government into nonprofit, your lens of the work and your lens of community is different being in government. And it was really welcoming to have a established community leader like George reach out to me. And George and I have continued to have lunches and check-ins over the years. So George, welcome and thank you. I want to ask you, where are we with racial equity? All of us remember the fireworks that kind of catalyzed the focus. We know with moments in movements that there are moments where things are very illuminated and things are very urgent and very immediate. And then we also know that there's always some kind of settling. And you've been involved with racial equity work here in DC, but you've also are connected nationally. So I would love to just ask you before we get into some of the specific questions, I would love for you to just give us a snapshot in your view of what has happened with the issue, what is happening with the work, what is happening with the movement. And before you respond, I'll just note to people, at some point you can put questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring those questions and trying to respond to them as best we can. But George, please.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, that's a big idea. George Floyd kicked off. I would like to say that George Floyd's murder kicked off, sort of the renewal of the civil rights movement in a lot of ways. And there were people, including Bradford City, who were already working in the anti-racism and racial equity space before that. But in many ways, on a larger scale, his murder really did galvanize sort of the country in a way that to be quite honest with you, our sort of on the ground efforts hadn't really been able to, elevate the movement to. And so, and that's both tragic, but it also obviously was important that the country responded the way that it did. As it relates to that response, some of the people, we talk about people who are really authentically and have been invested in this work and genuinely invested in this work. And some of the stuff I worry that's happening is performative. So when I see some institutions that, have, for instance, in racism in the back of their end zones, I'm like, okay, that's more performative than, are we really hiring people who look like the folks who look like George Floyd? Are we really doing the work that is, and are we really changing our systems in fundamental ways so that they don't either inadvertently or intentionally perpetuate racism? So that's a part of the challenge, is that we had that reboot of the civil rights movement. I think many more people are genuinely trying to advance anti-racism in their organizations, in their lives, in the cities and states where they live. And I worry too much of it is performative, and there may be something of value to the performative stuff too, because if the NFL puts in racism on in their end zones, people see that, and whether or not they genuinely care about ending racism or not, that message still gets out there, and that's one of the ways messaging happens in this country, we know. So the only other thing I'll say, Steve, about that is, there's all this sort of regressive, and that's putting it nicely, work that's being done on the right in this country, and that's been more robust than ever. And so maybe we shouldn't be surprised that when we get more people involved in and recommitting to anti-racism and racial justice, that the folks on the right push back just as hard. And maybe the biggest problem we have right now nationally is what the constitution of the Supreme Court, that is in fact where they are doing, I think, the most harm to our efforts to advance racial justice.
So you definitely, I knew that at some point in our conversation, the Supreme Court would come up, but it might be good because I think we know this, but I also think sometimes we get away from it. And this may be a little revisionary, but for me, it feels like it's a good reminder. Like, what are some of the indicators that drive inequity? Like, how does it show up in lives and communities and policies and programs? And I know you can iterate this all the way down to the ground, but I think it would be just good for our listeners to kind of hear, like, what are the indicators of inequity? Obviously, CNHED members are working, each of them, on parts of those indicators or elements of those indicators. But I wonder if the evidences are of impact are showing up in maybe a new list or a sculpted list of indicators. I just wonder if you have any response to that.
I won't be, probably for most people on this call, this probably won't reveal anything to them because the indicators in DC, everybody knows. They include housing inequity, they include health outcomes that are disproportionately negative for people of color. But as I think I mentioned to you before, I think so there's a whole list of things. You look at any indice in DC, and Black and brown people do worse than folks who identify as white. And so, and again, most of us know that. But I think I mentioned to you the other day that I think that the three that are most important are the wealth gap, the income gap, and the housing disparity. Basically the inability for Black and brown people to access affordable, decent housing at the levels that we need it. And so those are the three things. I think those are the three things that are driving poverty and racial disparity and inequity. I think many of the other things, those other indices, are just symptoms of those things. In a capitalistic society, and whether you like capitalism or not, and it's got huge problems, if you're going to be in a capitalist society, you need to have wealth, income, and housing, because everything else is destabilized when you don't have those things.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned capitalism. For those who know me, you know that I can kind of like sling concepts around. They're not always grounded, but they touch upon things. And there was a time when I used to say, for every Bill Gates, there have to be 1 million homeless people in America. Just from an economic equation point of view, if you have somebody holding up that much wealth, then it's got to show up from an equational point of view, in another way. So one of the things I remember, you and I spoke on a panel, gosh, this has got to be 5-6 years ago. And we were right in the era where DC was the subject of every known disparity study to man. I mean, there was education, incarceration, home ownership, home foreclosure, wealth, health, access to job training, and more. And have you seen any of the research of the studies? Have they narrowed in any way to we're being more incisive? It's interesting that you came up with that list. Maybe I should ask this another way. How did you land there? How did you land on wealth, health, and housing? What informed you because I think a sharpened focus around the indicators that are impacting us is great. And as you said, our audience is connected to those things in their day-to-day work.
I'm sure I've been evolving to sort of boiling it down to that. I've been in this work for 40 years now. And so I've been trying to figure out the answer of, one of my staff asked one time, why is it that the only people in DC who show up at an agency like Bread for the City is a Black or brown person or person of color? Like, why are we the only ones living in poverty in this city? And that may not be literally true, but it is virtually true, right? And and the question is, and people have all these theories, and many of us are sort of around, oh, it's workforce development, it's all these other kinds of things. But recently we did we've actually done several cash assistance initiatives. I and several other nonprofits and Breath City and several other nonprofits have been involved in these initiatives because we had already heard for years that, so not surprisingly, in a capitalist society, people who have more money tend to do better around these indices, and people who have less tend to do worse, right? Not surprising. And so we wanted to figure out, what if we simply gave people who had very low incomes more money? We tried to raise their economic floor. And even though these are pilots, how much better off would people be? And I have to say to you, so we've done a few of these kinds of cash assistance campaigns. We had one called Thrive East of the River, and we had about 500 families that we gave $5,500 to with no strings attached, no questions asked. And did any of them get out of poverty? Probably not many. But our studies show that the folks were not surprisingly better off. They were likely to be, even during that short period, we helped them to be less food insecure, to have fewer problems paying rent. Like they were able to use those dollars to do what all of us do with our money. And so your question was, why did I conclude that? Is because as a father of four, and I think about my four kids who are now all college graduates and running off and doing all kinds of great things. The American mythology would like to say, oh, they had great parents and they did all this great parenting and blah, 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 blah. But one of the problems with that theory is my four kids couldn't be more different than each other. So what the question is, which parenting strategy was it that I was using that was making all this good stuff happen? And here's the parenting strategy I used, is I made sure they had housing that was safe and secure. They never had to worry about whether they were going to eat. They were in safe communities. They lived in thriving communities. If you want to be a great parent, give your kids that, and they'll take care of the rest. It's my feeling about it.
That's really good.
And if you want to fix your communities, give your community members that, and they'll take care of the rest.
Yeah, I mean, for me, hearing that is like really old school community development, community economic development. As we worked on it, I mean, I hate to say this, in the 80s and the 90s, but there was an infrastructure of organizations around the country, community development corporations, and some others, community action agencies, that kind of took that approach. Jakia Carroll puts in the chat, dealing with root issues of modern enslavement and supremacy is the reality, and every level is impacted by mentality bred to continued psychological trauma. Got any response to that?
Systemic racism is real. The impact and effects of the history of racism is real. Slavery, Jim Crow, separate equal, all the other forms of oppression that Black people experience and other people of color experience in this country over the last 400 years, and to some degree continue to experience in much more subtle forms, or sometimes subtle, sometimes not. That's real stuff. That has to be undone. But I will say that, and so to get policies that deal with increasing the wealth and income and housing security that people have would require dismantling all of those forms of racism and all the root causes of racism that question alludes to. So yes, that's a real thing. And that's those of us who are working to sort of, when we talk about systemic reform, that's what we're talking about doing, is undoing all of that stuff. And we're talking about using strategies like reparations, guaranteed basic income, housing as a right. I mean, there are political and policy strategies that are at the root of what it would mean to sort of undo the racism that's caused, in my mind, that's caused all these disparities that Black and brown people experience disproportionately.
That's great. So in our exposure to the work and the people who lead it, we often hear two terms: racial justice and racial equity. Do these different terms hold any meaning for you, or are they placeholders for the same work, or are they definitely different?
I don't know. I mean, I actually have grown to using the term anti-racism, which is another term that sometimes get conflated with racial equity. there are people who could tell you the definitions better than I could. So I try not to get caught up in. One of my friends, a guy named Dushal Hackett, is when we spent some time sort of agonizing over whether it's DEI or racial equity or anti-racism. And he had this beautiful sort of notion. He's like, we should see it as an ecumenical kind of thing. Like we want everybody in the tent who's fighting for racial justice. And if you come in because DEI is your thing, or if you come in because racial equity is your thing, or you come in for anti-racism your thing, come one, come all to this church of racial justice, and we'll take you in, and we can lock arms and try to do the work. Somebody again in the chat said what I think I alluded to earlier about undoing all the stuff is maybe it's not happening in other ways. I'm not actually as cynical about whether or not progress is made around racial justice, to be honest with you. A lot of the younger people who work for Bread for the City always tell me, oh, George, ain't nothing changed. And I was like, one of the things I always say is, look, you wouldn't trade place. My ancestors, my great-grandparents were literally slaves. That's how old I am, by the way. They were enslaved people. And they ain't a person today that's going to change places with them. So I don't believe this narrative that nothing's changed. Are things still oppressive for people of color? Too much, and to too large of a degree. But we've seen too much progress, and our own people have put their lives on the line for the last 200 years to sort of say that none of what they did made any progress. And the truth of the matter is, for those of us who agonize about where we are now, the real call is it's our turn now. Yes, there's still things like modernized Jim Crow. There's the prison to the school to prison pipeline. There's all kinds of crap that we all know is real and is causing harm to Black and brown people. It's our time to bend the arc, as Dr. King would say, towards justice now. And so I am not saying it's why I do the work. It's why I wake up every morning excited about, really, if you can use the word excited, certainly committed to figuring out what can I do today to help advance anti-racism and Bread for the City first and foremost, and in the city secondly.
You know, it's interesting. Years ago when this first happened, I was asked to open up a weekend-long conference on racial equity, and I foolishly said, oh yeah, sure, that's great. And then as I began to reflect, I realized that that I really didn't know much, if anything, about racial equity as it was currently being stood up. I had to look at my own career as an integrationist, and I realized I've done a lot to help people navigate and survive racism, but I hadn't done anything to actually end it. And so I've looked at this is a younger generation's time to set new standards for how the work is approached and what success means. Because what my parents were even more different than me in that you were just happy to be in a system. And then what they gave to me was you get in that system and you try to make it a little better and you try to make it more navigational and more fair. And then comes along this moment or movement and it says, nah, like the heck with all of that. Like we need to tear this stuff down. It's embedded in the fiber of everything that we face. And I remember just realizing that we are in a different place.
I want to say something about that, Steve, that you triggered for me. First of all, but it's always been embedded. So, the fact that that we can't come up with a purely anti-racist country or city or organization or even be that ourselves, that's always been the challenge. And so that's no reason to sort of be cynical about being better than we were yesterday, right? Like the fact that things were horrible yesterday doesn't mean we can't say, well, today we're committing to trying to be a little bit better. One of the things that one of the sort of frameworks that we have embraced, many of us at Bread for the City have embraced, is this idea of upstream and downstream work. And so, what remind me of is the downstream work we do at Bread for the City is we hand people groceries and we provide them access to free, gently worn clothing, and we do, and sometimes we do more powerful than that. We go to court with them and keep them from being evicted, and we give them free access to healthcare. But all of those things, to be quite honest with you, are still downstream. In other words, The person was already in poverty when they got to us.
Mhm.
It was too late for this. These to be upstream interventions. These are downstream interventions. I tell my staff all the time, probably 80% of the breadth of the city staff are doing downstream work. And I tell them they don't have to be apologetic at all about that. People are living in poverty. They need access to stuff. That's valid work to do. But there are plenty of us at Breakfast City now, and we're urging folk in the city to go upstream and figure out why in the hell, as my staff has said, are all these Black and brown people showing up in poverty to us? Those are upstream questions, and we need to go upstream and say, how do you interrupt that? And again, I'm going to go back to what I said is fix the problem of wealth and income and housing inequality, and you will be doing the upstream work, and fix it at the systems level. Fix it at the government level, fix it at the policymaking level. You will be doing the upstream work that one day, that whole cliche of putting yourselves out to work, that's always just been a kind of, a riff that nonprofit leaders have talked about. But the only way for that to be real is for the upstream work to really be done.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's how do you break the cycles? I look at when I worked at HUD in the late 80s, and I looked at I worked for Jack Kemp. He was particularly for a conservative, somewhat progressive, although still protective of white wealth in many of his actual programs and policies, but he was also a disruptor. And I realize now that we haven't done nearly as much of that disruptive work in terms of those cycles. And maybe one of the reasons relates to some of the comments that are in the chat around the impact of systems on planning and zoning and everything. I think everyone's been exposed to some book or some documentary or some narrative around how zoning and planning has been the kind of pillars within systems of disparity. Any comment around that as it relates to work that you see and are doing, or maybe know of others that are doing?
I'm not sure I'm going to answer this question on point, so correct me if I'm wrong. But I will say that, the systemic stuff that I know about that's happening, a group of activists got together about 6 or 7 years ago and really pushed the district to create something called racial equity legislation. I think it's called the REACH Act now.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really important. The government, by the way, that legislation now exists in DC. So a real piece of public policy that says the district is going to do government work, public policy work in a racially equitable way. It is not, by the way, doing that. And so one of the lessons that you learn is you can get legislation and then you've got to get people to really operationalize it. And I think, and this is a really controversial thing to say, I'll probably lose some funding for saying this, but I think that a really important example of this is the crime bill that's being pushed forward. And I understand all the reasons that the crime bill has been put. Like, look, people's loved ones are losing their lives. I don't want to minimize crime and everything, but we all know that at best that's going to be a real reactive sort of response to crime, like all the stuff that's baked into that. And again, I'm not suggesting that poverty causes crime. I don't. In fact, I'm going to say that that's not true. But I will say that the kinds of stress that produces the explosive, counterproductive responses to stress and trauma, like crime, they just don't happen in places where the communities are thriving. They don't happen to the degree. Not to say that people, privileged people, wealthy people, people with livable incomes don't do crimes. They do. But those things don't happen at that level. And so you can invest in a crime bill that's a downstream thing that is politically expedient, but it doesn't address the fact that these communities are really struggling with things. And by the way, it also didn't address the fact that, again, another thing that's going to be politically correct to folks on the left, the right. Like, you can't have all these guns in a country and expect them not to be used. That's the upstream solution. We got a problem with too many guns. The downstream solution is arrest anybody who uses them. But it seems ridiculous to me to produce guns at the mass level that we do in this country and expect that they're not going to generate crime. Like, that's what That's what guns are good for, right? And so that's going to happen. And
So,
by the way,
you know,
it's going to happen. It's going to happen for just trying to figure out how to make good choices in their lives.
that's right.
And you literally armed them with something that can allow them to make bad choices about dealing with problems and concerns and struggles that they have.
Well, you know, it's interesting, and this is going to be a little veer off, and I promise we'll come back. And I'd be interested in your reaction as well as the audience's. One of my observations is that we are in an era of intentional outlawism among some of our young and disenfranchised. And I've been wondering how much has social media contributed to their perception of their disenfranchisement. There is there's a disregard for the laws, not just fallacies in how laws are constructed. And what I mean is all the over 18-year-olds get all the under 18-year-olds to steal the cars because they know they're not going to do any time and so forth. But just I'm wondering, is greater awareness around racial inequity contributing to this in any way that you see?
Well, I know the statistics say some things about crime, but I'm cynical about the whole. What I think the media does is it makes a living off of socializing all of these crimes. I tell the story about I live right outside of DC, and I live in Virginia, and I was watching watching the news one morning, and every morning when we hear the news, there's some series of crimes that are reported in DC. But apparently on this particular morning, no crimes had been committed in DC the night before. And so I got piped into on my news, crimes that were happening all over the country. Like the media was insistent on telling me who committed a crime. And when they didn't have something to talk about in DC, they just pumped in what happened in Richmond and what happened in California. And I was like, this is just fodder for them. And here's the other thing I will say that really pisses me off about the whole. This is a country that enslaved people, killed people, bringing them over the Middle Passages, lynched people. Anybody saying to us that this country is more violent today than it was 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago, that is BS. This country has socialized violence and crime. And for Black people in particular, yes, we got some radical kids running around shooting at each other.
Well,
there were 3 Black people being in the 1950s and 40s. There were 3 Black people being lynched every day in this country. That's a crime. That's violence. And so this narrative about suddenly people are more crime ridden in this country, like that doesn't comport to me. That does not add up to me. Like this country had never been better. There's no reason to make us great again because we have never been great. Not in that sense.
Well, it's interesting. So this is really old reporting. I'll do that disclaimer up front. But I remember decades ago, there was a young white teenage suicide pact that happened in Northern Virginia and got reported on the news. And it triggered a series of them. So it was one, and then it was another, and then another, as I recall. And the execs from our media, when they realized that their reporting had triggered, they kind of made a pact that they would not do this reporting if something like that happened again. And to your point about, I mean, the lead story on most network news is either what young person of color committed a crime or was killed or whatever. And I think it contributes to this socialization. But I don't want to go too off topic on that because I think that might be another discussion. There was a question.
I will say though, Steve, why is it let's say I'm sitting over here east of the river. This may be, I don't know, 80,000 people in this ward alone, Ward 8, and maybe let's say that 30,000 of them are kids. If 2 kids shoot somebody tomorrow, and God bless them, one death is a tragedy, right? So I'm not trying to belittle that. But what about the stories about the other 29,998 kids who didn't shoot anybody yesterday? Somehow that's not newsworthy. And they all just get painted with that same brush.
I think that's consistent with, my story about the intentionality of reporting and how that impacts it. And maybe it's not intentionality, but it's certainly, there's an accountability element to that. There was one question in there for you about, have you ever partnered with the Associated Black Charities in Baltimore?
No, I haven't, but I mean that certainly be open to it. I don't know much about. I don't know anything about them. So
So let's get maybe a little back-centric topic. This was a question that was kind of created in advance by some of the people. What does an anti-racist DC look like to you?
great question. You know, as you know, I'm a part of a coalition of folks who have created a campaign that is still that is very much fledgling, I acknowledge, but it is called Anti-Racist DC, and it attempts to figure out how do we dismantle, how do we undo all the disparities that show up here in Washington, D.C. They show up all over the country, by the way, but in DC, which is, and only affect, one of the things that's more unique about DC is it only seems to be people of color who experience these disparities in income and wealth, in housing, in food insecurity, in lifespan. I mean, you name again. So an anti-racist city, you would no longer see indices trending negatively along racial lines. Black people wouldn't die sooner. They wouldn't be poorer. They wouldn't be unhoused. I mean, and I know that's asking for a lot, but all that's asking for is racial justice. All that's asking for is justice. In one of the richest countries on the planet and in the history of the world, that doesn't seem like too much to ask for. And given that this country is in a large part what it is because of the 200 to 300 years of slavery and the 100 years of Jim Crow, where Black people simply toiled to make all of these edifices and this wealth show up, it doesn't seem like too much to ask for us to equitably benefit from that largesse that's been generated in this country.
And I just want to note Susan's, I think I'm gonna get this name right, Punet's comment. I'm so grateful for the upstream, downstream framing, going to be so helpful in moving our work forward. And I really do think that that's an important, I mean, the upstream work it takes time and it takes money. And unfortunately, in our political ecosystem, if the answer takes time and money, it's not the answer. So much so that, you know, you could make arguments for some electoral restructuring, because if you look at electoral patterns, people don't have the luxury of investing in strategies that take time and money because results won't show up by re-election time. And we really do get trapped into that at a national level and at a local level as well. And so I just appreciate Susan's comment about that. You know, you mentioned the three things, and obviously a lot of CNHED members are connected to housing. And housing hadn't been always a part of the list when people talked about equity. And I know CNHED members, many take the view that, you know, you can't develop someone until you stabilize them, that stabilization is important. But have you seen that clearly in your work with Bread? Because the clients that come through your door generally have a multitude of needs. You know, they may come for food, but they also need housing and substance abuse help and all kinds of other things. And just say a little more about the importance of housing.
99% of everybody who comes to Bread for the City is housing insecure. Whether they identify that, and oftentimes that is not the lead issue they come to us. Oftentimes it's food, not surprisingly, because stereotypically people identify our food insecurity work, our food security work with Bread for the City. But almost all of those folks ultimately reveal that they're having some problem either finding affordable housing, maintaining it, or about to be evicted from it. And we have a law practice here that helps people, in fact, fight eviction, because we know that is so common part of the narrative that folks show up with. But the other thing I would say about housing, Steve, is sometimes I think about, again, I acknowledge I'm sort of a person who is learning this stuff as I go along. And again, I've been at it 4 years, so I'm not an expert. I didn't go to college and get some degrees about this stuff. So, I'm not suggesting that my opinions are right. They certainly are informed by the experiences of the work I've been doing. But what I would say about housing is, to me, it's kind of a proxy for money. That it is just the most expensive thing that we have to get. And so if I can't get equity in terms of wealth and income, I better have it in terms of housing, because because those are the two things that would otherwise let me be independent in terms of getting my housing. So housing is, in a lot of ways, is the biggest form of, you talked about it earlier when you and I were talking about, it's an asset, right? That oftentimes people equate with wealth and money. And it's because oftentimes you could liquidate it and it would be money, right? In a way that, your grocery bag, you liquidate that and it's going to be chump change. And so
it's so true. I have two siblings, and my mom and dad were together until they died. So they were happily married until they died. And I didn't realize it. My mom went first and then my dad. And I didn't realize it when my mom got sick, my dad could take care of her. When my dad got sick, my siblings and I, we were like, we wanted him to have a comfortable end of life. We thought that meant putting him in assisted care. And when we broached him about that, his response to the suggestion was violent. And I didn't expect it and I didn't understand it, but he literally said to me, your mom and I had a lifelong strategy to leave your brother and sister with a mortgage-free home, because that would be assets that you could use to help your kids. I never realized how intentional a strategy it was with my parents, and I paid attention to that, and I agree with you on that. Adam Meyer puts in the chat that we do have to recognize that DC's human rights law recognizes 23 protected classes, and people need to take advantage of that, whether it's filing for discrimination in housing, work, or other things. Adam, that's a good note. Let me see if there are two more messages in here. So you had mentioned that the work is embedded in Bread's kind of, DNA. And I think I heard you say it's always been there, but I want to circle back and say, has it always been there? And I asked this reason for a question. When this emerged as the post-George Floyd movement, one of our first thoughts here was, we have 100 nonprofit members and we have 60 mission-driven for-profits. And how do we help organizations get that into their DNA, maybe even more than it already is? I think a lot of CNHED members would offer that, they do their work through a racial equity lens. But a question I have is, did it heighten for you? So it was always there. You always had a sensitivity and a line of sight on it. But did it heighten for you? Did you do more, do different as a result of the call to action post George Floyd?
Well, actually, let me correct the record if I said it was always there. It actually hasn't always been there. When I first got to Bread, we had some clumsy missteps trying to figure out how to deal with the race question, but we weren't really doing racial equity, and we didn't have that language even then. And so our efforts were much more stereotypical things like, I don't know, bringing in people about race to talk about race, trying to, have a conversation. The truth of the matter is, it's pretty easy for me to date when Bread more intentionally and explicitly sort of thought about embedding racial equity in our work. And it was right after Trayvon Martin was murdered. It really was that was the day. It was probably a few days after he was murdered that my staff came to me and said, why don't we ever deal with race? Don't we know that racism is a part of the reason that perpetuates the work we have to do and the reason so many Black and brown people show up here? And so we've been on that journey actually ever since. So that's what, 2011, 2012 now. So really, we're talking about only 12 to 13 years where we have been intentional about it. And it's been fits and starts, to be honest with you. So even to say that it's embedding is probably giving us a little more credit. We're all still trying to just like that ecumenical place, we're all over the place in some ways about what it means to be anti-racist. Like the truth of the matter is, you have to almost internalize. This is like an inside-out job, right? Like the first question to ask you is, am I behaving in an anti-racist way? Then is my organization, is my family, is my, you know, I heard somebody ask the question the other day on TV, like, what's the difference between, like, how do you define institutional racism? How do you define systemic racism? You know, you should also be defining interpersonal racism and personal racism. That is the analysis. Somebody used the term analysis. That's the analysis one has to go through if they really want to understand what it would take to be not only someone who's anti-racist, but who knows how to advance anti-racism. You need to have analysis that is an individual analysis, interpersonal analysis. That means between you and somebody else, an institutional analysis, your organization or whatever institution you're associated with. Does that organization become anti-racist? And systemically, how do all of those institutions that make up our society become? That's what a systemic solution looks like. It's every one of those institutions that have understand how to do it. And by the way, that's a tall order. But before I think that's sort of pie in the sky, I always say, you know, I'll bet you my ancestors, my ancestors that I know, whose names I know because I've done their genealogy work, were slaves, were young enslaved people in 1850. I bet you they didn't even believe that by 1863, 1865, depending on what date you choose, that slavery would be legally ended. In other words, they probably were just as cynical about people who today would say, you're not going to create anti-racist systems as they were about, you're not going to end slavery. Slavery had existed for them all the time they knew about, all the history they knew about. Why would they think that something like that slavery was going to end? And yet 15 years after my relatives I know of who were enslaved were born, slavery was in the...
You know, I think that's a really great point to illuminate.
Somebody says slavery still exists. Slavery in the United States, and maybe they still would say slavery still exists. I don't know if they meant this.
I mean, I think that's a really great point that offers hope. Sometimes you look at this and being cynical is really easy. I mean, just in my own family, the reason my father met my father was from Mobile, Alabama. His family moved him up here when he was 12 because they were still lynching young Black boys in Mobile during his adolescence. He came up here and met my mom. And that wasn't that long ago either. I really do think that point of hope is a good one. I really appreciate you drawing those lines in time, because there are times when we look at the work, we look at how much there is that needs to be done, and it can be paralyzing, it can be immunizing, it can be numbing, it can be other things, and yet we have progress that we should embrace and celebrate, and we should never not see the road ahead, but realize that progress is occurring and happening. There is one question for you that actually, when you were talking about the upstream, downstream, it's been one of my kind of pillars of how we disrupt. And the question was, could you speak about the importance of education, for example, financial education or housing counseling? And I would also add to that even primary education, of getting our people, getting Black and brown people, having access to quality education as part of that disruptor of the cyclical conditions that we often face.
No, obviously all of those things are good things, and some of those things, particularly, we oftentimes use and implement those at the downstream level. And so, you know, people who are already living in poverty and trying to use education or trying to use programs. I have a mentor who tells me, you know, we're just not going to program our way out of this problem. And I think I agree with that, that was one of the lessons I had learned. Is I used to tell, like so many of the nonprofit leaders, that somehow these programs at Bread for the City were the cure to poverty. It was clearly, in a way, it was clearly just sort of me trying to get them to give money. And now I tell them, this is downstream stuff. that if you want to invest in ending the reason that you pay me money to give people food, then you should be paying for the upstream work. But back to your question, so as much as I know, as much as hallowed education is, and financial literacy is, and all that stuff is really important. If you're in a thriving community, those things are going to be much more catalytic and impactful in your life, at least on average, than they are going to be if you're living in an impoverished community. And so another way of thinking about this, Steve, because a lot of my donors tell me this, and we should be doing education. I say, you know what? That's all great. Like, you can talk about that and how powerful that is in your life. But here's the bottom line. It goes back to something I said before. If education and financial literacy and all those things were such panaceas to getting out of poverty, why don't you put your children in poverty and let them use all those tools to get out? You don't do that. You know what you do? You try to give them every single advantage that you can give them around housing and safety. And then you will know that those other things are great things to offer the foundation you gave them. And maybe that's the best way to say this. Those things aren't really foundational. They are important things, but if you're trying to, we need to get off this rags to riches kick, this bootstrap thing, because that's a myth in this country. That is not how people are largely succeeding. And if you drink that Kool-Aid, you're going to be trying to come into communities like this and say, if I can just teach you how to manage your money, ain't no money to manage.
Mm-hmm.
The average client I have has an income of about $10,000 a year. That's what they're trying to live off in DC. And when I have donors asking me, don't you want to offer them money management services? I say to them, if you know how to live in Washington, DC on $10,000 a year, you ought to be telling me how to manage money. But I can't figure out how you're doing it, to be quite honest with you.
I think that's a fair point. In the comments, there's some questions about disabilities and how that there is disparity within the disability. Like, if you layer disability on top of race and other things, and I know you and I've worked with disability organizations and programs. Do you have any particular comment around that?
Amen is all I can say, is that absolutely that, when it comes to equity, we should be talking about equity for people who experience or live with disabilities. Often, and to some degree, by the way, all of us do, because like none of us are 100% mentally well. Like mental wellness is like a degrees, and yes, some people have like clinical illnesses, but all of us are struggling to be, our best selves mentally. And so we should have some empathy for the fact that support for those kinds of realities about the human condition is important. But there are people who, I know that question really is talking about people who have the more sort of limiting, if you will, disabilities or inabilities. And yes, we should be really intentional. And when we do this work, and so there's the intersectionality is what a lot of people call it, about ability and disability, about race, about gender, like about those kinds of things. Because I mean, people are really sort of another cynical part of the society right now is about the accommodations or that we try to make around gender, for instance. But the truth of the matter is, if you look at socioeconomic indices around gender, whether it's for non-conforming people or just women in general, they do worse than the rest of us, and there's no reason for that. There's no reason for we pay less than men for comparable work. But that's a reality in this country. It is potentially a reality in DC. I don't know if that's true. I haven't looked at the statistics, but the point is that, and it's also true for people with disabilities, is that the kind of disparities that play themselves out in their lives, we need to try to intentionally interrupt. And by the way, and it doesn't matter whether you think you caused it or not. It doesn't matter whether you think you had it, you weren't. I didn't own any slaves some time ago. I ain't called nobody out of their name. I didn't do. The bottom line is, it's a fellow citizen. If we want justice to reign in this country and in our city, we ought to care about all of those folks, and we ought to be ready to do what it takes to bring out equity across gender lines, across race lines, and across ability lines.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I offer this up for any corrective insight you might want to offer. But when I was wrestling with the realities of capitalism, and in my own view, I believed that as long as we're in a capitalist society, that there have to be, just from a pure economic equation point of view, there have to be poor people. And so every now and then in my 45-year career, I've asked myself, why am I doing this work? Knowing that the equation, so there's capitalism and there's racism, and when you put two together, it's an even bigger beast. And then one day I resolved it within my own thinking by saying, look, if I'm born to two crack addicted parents, I go to schools that don't teach, I have to navigate violence to my places, between my places of work, worship, and recreation. But I decide I'm going to rise above it. It shouldn't be because of programs that don't work, policies that aren't fair, or lack of political will to support my path. And I found some solace in that. Does that apply in our work in racial equity too? Is that approach or formula good thinking, or is there something more? So, one of the things I love about our conversations is we talk freely, and sometimes you say, well, Steve, that's not quite right. So is there an element of what I just described in how we should approach continuing this work and struggle around racial equity?
Let me make sure I'm understanding, because there's something in it for you potentially.
No, it's not because it's anything in it for other than commission.
Or because it's the right thing to do.
It's because it's the right thing to do. Because so if you look at the equation and the mountain, there is an element of hopelessness to this, because those are two big isms that govern and impact everything that we navigate in our work and in our effort to try to help others. So, if you accept that from an economic equation, that in capitalism there have to be poor people, just not because of attitudes about race or even attitudes about class, which are two pillars within capitalism, and then the connecting racism, but just the pure economic equation. Like I always say, for every Bill Gates, there have to be 1 million homeless people. Economically, that is how things are structured. You couldn't have someone with that much wealth and not have people poor at the same time.
Well, first of all, I don't know why people need that much. I don't know why somebody needs $200 billion unless they're planning to live like 200 years. This feels like that's just overkill. Nobody needs that much money. But it is an equation that, in some ways, the equation is what you said, that there's an equation now that says to have all these billions and mega billionaires, you have to have poor people. Well, there could be an equation that says you just can't have all of that because you don't want poor people. Like, that's the solution to that. That's the transformation that would happen to capitalism, is this commitment to, you just can't have, somebody said the other day, and this statistic is stunned to me because it makes me have to rethink. I have a narrative about, the poverty that I take from DC, like 81% of the white people in DC have 81 times the wealth of Black people. That's a statistic. But there's a problem, at least if the fact that somebody, or the data point somebody gave me the other day, is true. They told me that actually 46% of the wealth in DC is owned by like 1,600 people in the city. So that skews this 81%. In other words, there are a lot of white people who ain't got 81 times the wealth. If 16%, if 1,600 people in a city of 700,000 people have 40-some percent of the wealth. So that 81 times is an average. And so that's a little bit of a flaw in that whole narrative. I'm not saying it doesn't still sort of, there isn't this disparity that exists. It clearly does. But the point is that the math isn't quite as clear and as simple as that right. Sort of original premise had. But with that having been said, I think that the transformation of capitalism is one of the things. Like, I think that all of what we're talking about is transforming systems, and capitalism is a system that could be transformed, and it could be transformed just to make the equation different than the one exists now, right? Which is, if we're going to have all this wealth, there got to be some poor people. So that's something that's some of the work that needs to be done, and it's a hard piece of work, of course. But it's interesting because there are people who are in that community, those wealthy people, who might have some sympathy with that view. I'm sure they're really loving living wealthy, And that's going to be a hard thing. All of us have problems thinking about giving up our privilege. Like you can identify with folk when somebody starts to say you got to give up some of your privilege. But there are many of us who would consider giving up some of that privilege if it made for a more just world. Because something you were talking about is it about the right thing to do or self-interest? And it is both. That I think there invariably you're going to find that it is both the morally right thing to do to create a more just city, an anti-racist city, and it's in the best interest of the people who have created the privilege. One of the statistics you probably know better than I know, Steve, is there's this whole data set that says that if people were, the employment was 100% in this city, that there would be billions of dollars in revenue generated. And that would benefit everybody, not just the people who suddenly were in the workforce, but including even that they had in there, like there's a cost to trying to hire folks with disability. Yeah, there is. But on a macro level, I think that 100% employment, even for people who have supported employment situations, would be in the best interest of us economically, which we all benefit from. And here's the piece that selfishly and on a micro level that's beneficial. There's probably nobody in this city who doesn't have somebody who's either non-gender conforming in their family, disabled, or just unemployed. And so on a micro level, you benefit from, because somebody you care about is going to be better off. It might not be you, and that makes a difference.
Well, and I would add to that it reverberates backwards to positive impacts on you, because if you have someone in your family that is challenged in those ways, in some ways you're supporting and helping them. And if they were more self-sufficient, more engaged, more centrally connected, then it would have a ripple effect benefit.
More included is a good word. More included in the opportunities that we privileged folks enjoy.
So, as I knew would be the case, our hour has flown by. I'm going to cling to Meg McGuire's last comment, saying this has been a really great conversation. Can we have another conversation with Mr. Jones at some point in the future? The answer to that is yes. George, I just want to thank you for coming and sharing with us. What I love about you is that, and I don't want to say this in an all-knowing way, but what I observe about you is that you don't fatigue about this. And I'm sure you probably go home and there's some days that are tough, and you may get an L on something that, it's just not hard, not easy to swallow, but it never shows up in your resolve to work, to lead, to take risks. I've been in rooms with George where George has said the most controversial thing that's been said in a 2-hour meeting. And I respect that about you, and I appreciate. When I was younger, facing tough politics early in my career, I came up with the phrase, "I get my love at home," and I use that to try to bolster my own courage. But I've seen you really say the thing that bothers people the most, which means it's probably the most accurate and the most penetrating. Throughout the years that I've been here, you're consistent about that. So I want to thank you for spending time with us. I want to thank you for the work you do at BRED, and I want to thank you for the work that you do around racial equity. I think that you lead and inspire us in so many ways. Thank you so very much. And everyone, we'll see you at whatever next month's meeting is. You all know how to track George down at BRED for the City and pay attention to his great work. And we'll be in touch with you all soon. Thanks so much. Thanks, George. Much appreciated.
Take care. Thank you.